we're going to be looking at the origins of feminism, the question of suffrage, and the relationship between feminism and socialism, which is not always a nice and easily defined relationship, and often is fraught with a lot of problems. In the 18th century, there were a number of different responses to the woman's question. One of the key places where you found women in the 18th century was as hostesses of the salons where the philosophes hung out. One of the more significant ones is Madame Geoffrin, who was the hostess of the salon that Voltaire was a part of. Diderot was a part of this. She was well known. Now, don't get me wrong, there was not just one hostess. There were multiple ones. There were aristocratic hostesses, and there were more middle-class ones, much like, or bourgeoisie more correctly, much like Madame Geoffrin. In England, the intellectual women became known as blue stockings. Now, blue stockings for many fashionable women was an insult. It was not a compliment. And the Queen of the Blues was the woman that you see here in the middle of the painting, and that is Elizabeth Montagu. And her circle of these educated women are all depicted here as the muses surrounding the god Apollo. Now, they were called the blue stockings because the men who hung out with them were so unfashionable that their stockings were old and had turned blue in color instead of being white. These blue stockings wrote. The salon hostesses in France rarely did, but the blue stockings in England did. Some of them were aristocratic women like Montague. Some were more middle class or gentry, but they wrote in the humanities and the sciences. They wrote commentaries on scripture. They wrote commentaries on Shakespeare. They wrote histories. They wrote scientific treatises. So they wrote a lot of different things to contribute to the discussion and to kind of go against this tide that argued that women didn't have the ability to reason. So what were the positions on the question of women, and what do we really mean? The whole women question is about what the nature of woman is. Is a woman different from man? Is she the same as man? If she's different, how is she different? And what should her role be based on what the difference is and what the relationship is between male and female? And it's circled around this question about whether or not women were inferior. And if it sounds like we're recycling some things from Aristotle and Plato, then it should, because we are. And Plato and Aristotle both are going to show back up. Now, the standard social position in both England and the continent put women in a legally and socially inferior position, at least to a point. And the to a point is in terms of social position, because women had a great deal of authority in social circumstances, much like Madame Geoffrin. They did not, however, own property in their own name if they were a married woman. Women could own property, don't get me wrong, but a woman could only own property if she were unmarried, and likely if her father or brothers were not involved in any way. Okay. If a woman got married, particularly in Britain, then her money was not her own. Nothing, in fact, she owned. There's a famous case in which a woman's purse is stolen, and it is not actually her purse. It's considered legally to be her husband's purse, which is a great PR campaign for women's rights. Okay. There was always a question about when you dealt with the restrictions based on women, that they couldn't participate politically. They could support candidates by funds if they had them at their disposal, but they can't vote and they can't hold property, and there are a lot of legal restrictions on what women can do. So what do you do with women rulers? Maria Theresa has to fight wars to defend her throne. Catherine the Great. And also you get, in fact, Queen Victoria. Well, Victoria is a bad example because Victoria thinks women are inferior herself. The women rulers were kind of the outliers because they got there not through election, but by inheritance. And that made them this odd kind of thing to deal with. Um, there were many who argued for an inherent difference that made women inferior and that they were relegated to hearth and home, that they should only reach fulfillment when they were wives and mothers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very much one of those who argues for this position. Uh, Now, amongst the philosophers, there were lots of different positions. Rene Descartes, who operates at the early portion of the Enlightenment in the late 17th century and early 18th century, is going to talk about the kind of idea of a Cartesian dualism, that reason is independent of the body. And from that argument that reason and the mind and the body are two separate things, that dualism, which is very much kind of Platonic in its origins, is going to come a whole kind of cadre of folks who don't support this concept of women and women being particularly different. It's best illustrated by Francois Poulon de la Barre. He writes a 3-part series on the equality of the sexes, and there's 3 of them. I'm only giving you one title. And he argues that the mind has no sex, and that yes, their bodies are different, but the only differences reside in the body, not in the mind. And the mind is what matters. That's where reason is. That's where capacity is. And yes, there are some physical differences between men and women, but that's all it amounts to. It's not a mental difference. And he dismisses the fact that there should be any kind of legal difference between men and women. Guys like Philippe Poussin and Joseph Caffot and the Defense of the Fair Sex will kind of espouse very similar ideas, and all in kind of using Cartesian dualism, and that the mind is separate from the body kinds of arguments. And you also get Neoplatonic thought. Now, in some ways, Descartes is closer to real, actual Platonic thought than these guys are. And the Platonic thought guys are going to argue for what he calls gender, what is usually phrased as gender complementarity. And what this means is, yes, there are two different, right? There's different sexes. There's a male and there's a female, and they are different. And that's great, because we need both, and that they are complementary. They do different things, but you need both for society to function, and without them, society doesn't function. But all of those roles were rational for Neoplatonists. They were not ones that were irrational. It did not speak to women's basic inability to reason. We see some of these things in John Locke's ideas. Locke's going to argue for the education of women, that women must be educated. Otherwise, how can you have a citizen participating in any sort of Republican government, or democratic government of any sort, because then women cannot. You don't have you have half your citizenship uneducated, and that won't work. Denis Diderot, who's going to be one of the major scions of the Enlightenment in France, is going to argue for the differences, but doesn't believe in the superiority of men. Okay, he's going to reject the superiority of men. I know it says but superior of men, but it means rejection of superiority. Then there's a blended position, a position that's going to take part of Cartesian dualism and Neoplatonic thought, and is going to say there is no difference in the mind. There are differences in the body, but there's no differences in the mind. But we also should think that they're complementary. Antoine Leonard Thomas in 1770s is going to actually write kind of a history of men and women across the ages, and try to debunk the idea that women need to have irrational roles, or just be relegated away from kind of discussions of politics and other things. Now, the greatest one who's going to address the women question, really, though, is in fact going to be a woman, and it's going to be Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft is usually given the term of very much the early feminist. Sometimes she's called the first feminist if they're discounting Christine Pizon. Sorry. Wollstonecraft comes from a rather difficult situation. She is the second child out of 7. She had a grandfather who did very, very well for himself. But her father was a spendthrift. At one point, he tries to invest all the profits from her grandfather's business to make himself into a gentleman farmer, and it doesn't work. And it's the first of several disasters financially. And eventually, at some points, her mother is working to, in fact, support the family, and then her father will get rid of it, will just spend all the profits. And because of the property laws in England, he can do that. Of the children, the only child who winds up with an education is one particular brother who will become a lawyer. Wollstonecraft does learn to read and to write. She leaves home in 1780 to earn her own way through teaching and publishing. She writes a number of works, including Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, which shows very much the influence of John Locke's ideas about education. And this is one of the great quotes from Locke about this, that the cure those false byways and which ought to have never taken root in the infant mind. Good habits, imperceptibly fixed, are far more preferable to the precepts of reason. And so, in other words, you've got to actually to educate your women so that you have a good citizenship. She's going to write some other works about the original stories of real life and some of her own experiences. What's going to bring her to a notoriety for the rest of the philosophes is what she's going to say about Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke's Reflections is not well received by the philosophic community, largely because he's arguing against the concept of natural rights, that rights are not going to be a product of struggle, as we've talked about. And Wollstonecraft is going to find that rather offensive, and she's going to write a couple of different things. She's going to write a vindication of the rights of man and a vindication of the rights of woman. And her vindication of the rights of women is going to be the one that's the most significant. She's going to have a number of problems with her love life. She has a disastrous relationship with Gilbert Imlay. Imlay is abusive to her. He is going to cheat on her with other women. He is going to steal funds from her, and she doesn't seem to be able to break out of this rather codependency relationship. She finally leaves him in 1796. She is not going to marry him. She'd actually been married a time before, and once again, the same kind of problems that had cropped up with her parents had come in. So she just lives with Imlay, but it's going to be a disastrous sort of relationship. Eventually, she takes up with William Godwin. Goodwin is quite frankly, much better to her and for her than Imlay was. She's been burned very heavily, and she, for a long time, will not marry Godwin, even though she is going to be living with him. Eventually, she will have children by him, the most notable of which is going to be a daughter named Mary. And now Wollstonecraft and her vindication on rights of the woman is going to be the most significant of her writings. And in this work, she talks a lot about a number of issues, some of which sound very, very familiar to our ears, and others of which are very much related to her own time. A couple of folks had commented on some long-windedness of a couple of authors. She is no exception. It's not a matter of male or female in the 18th century. They're all long-winded, okay? And she's in this book, she's not actually just talking about men. She fusses at the men, but make no mistake, she fusses at women a lot in this work. She is angry with women and about how they accept the treatment that they're getting, but she's also angry at them because of the way they behave and what consequences that has. She thinks that women were ill prepared for society and given false expectations about what society was going to be look like. They're not educated properly, and they've come to depend too much on their bodies to get what they want, and that she does not approve of. This focus on using their bodies, their how they dressed, how they acted, how they flirted, and how they were taught to flirt with their fans. I don't have a fan, but I'm acting like I do. Um, are going to be things that they use this kind of coquettishness. And she said, at whatever levels of society you were taught to use your body as a woman, and that she finds offensive. You need to stop dressing in revealing ways. Now, what does she mean by revealing? Well, the late 18th century and early 19th century is going to have this whole fad of wetting down the petticoats. And if you wet down the petticoat, you can see through the skirt and see your legs. And this is why you're supposed to wear a slip. This is what the whole petticoat business was about, but that's not what they're doing. And it's a very fast method. It's very racy, and there's a lot of racy kind of dress in this period. And so she's fussing about that. So what are her goals in this? Not just to get women to stop using their bodies to get what they want, although she talks a lot about that. She also thinks that they need to cultivate their own education through skills, not just learning how to dance or how to paint, like upper class women were taught, but be educated for a variety of careers, and that includes mathematics, which was rarely taught to women. They need that because that would make them fully human and then able to take their place in society and politics. They would be better wives and mothers if they would do this, much less good citizens. She also wants property rights for women. She spends a lot of time on that, and she's seen a lot of the abuses of the lack of those property rights for women in her own family and her own experiences. She's very much about that. It's one of the reasons why she resides a lot in France, is because she's angry at the property laws in England. She also insists on women being more modest. That's part of not using your body to get your own way. She thinks marriage should be based on friendship and not just physical attraction. She thinks that way is harmful to marriage and society. And she's kind of, well, really one who's had a lot of that experience. She wanted more professions open to women and other things that she talks about. So in many ways, she's got a lot of the hallmarks of a modern feminist kind of writer, but she's also got this whole other strand where she's angry at women, and she holds them responsible for what she sees to be errors in their behavior and how they're treating themselves. She certainly wants a full citizenship and political participation. She's actually rather disappointed that the women are not given the full rights in France, as part of the revolution, that they're not given full rights to vote and things of this nature. Well, that marks the end of my lecture on Wollstonecraft and the women's question of the 18th century. The next section of this is going to actually deal with what we call the waves of feminism and how that works itself out. And I will see you next time.